So we're now going to start to consider whether or not descriptive egoism is true. That is it true that each person does whatever is most in their self-interest? Sometimes people are motivated to do what is in their most in their self-interest and are willing to sacrifice the welfare of others to get it. They're willing to help, they're not willing to help others and willing to harm others, but they make mistakes about what is in their own self-interest. And so really, if we were going to be fully precise, we'd want to say each person does whatever they believe is most in their self-interest. But we're going to make this simple for now and just assume that everyone does know what is in their self-interest. And then given that assumption, we can say that descriptive egoism says each person does whatever is most in their self-interest. This is a problem that has, whether or not humans are this egoistic, are only capable of doing what is in their self-interest and are never capable of sacrificing in any way their own self-interest for the interest of others. It's a problem that has worried people for a long time. So this is Plato and Mengzi. They're ancient Greek and Chinese philosophers from roughly 4th century BCE, so 400 or 500 years before the birth of Christ, or the beginning of the Common Era, however we want to talk about that. And they both, in the end, wanted to argue that humans are not entirely egoistic and shouldn't be either. So they rejected both descriptive egoism and ethical egoism. And we'll see what they have to say about that as we proceed and what you saw in the readings. So do you always act selfishly doing what is in your self-interest? I mean, it might seem false. This is what Mengzi wants to tell us. So in chapter 6, part 7, he says, the feeling of commiseration belongs to all men. That's empathy, feeling pain when others are in pain. So does that of shame and dislike, and that of reverence and respect, and that of approving and disapproving. The feeling of commiseration implies the principle of benevolence, of well-wishing for others. That of shame and dislike implies the principle of righteousness. That of reverence and respect implies the principle of propriety. And that of approving and disapproving the principle of knowledge. So benevolence, wishing others well; righteousness, being concerned with what is right and just; propriety, what is proper in sort of he's thinking here of sort of maybe familial relations and hierarchies in society, which we might not be so sympathetic with; and knowledge are not infused into us from without. We are certainly furnished with them. So not only do we have benevolence and righteousness and propriety and knowledge as manifest in these feelings of commiseration and respect and approving and disapproving and shame and dislike, but he thinks they're innate. They're part of human nature. And it's only when things go wrong in our development that we lack these. So that's what Mengzi wants to say, and it's pretty plausible that people, at least at first blush, that in fact people are, these principles are active in people and that they lead people to do things that are not in their self-interest. At the most extreme example, we can imagine people sacrificing their lives. So a soldier sacrificing their life to save that of their comrades, or a political activist, say a civil rights activist, putting themselves in harm's way and potentially losing their lives, as some civil rights activists did, in order to promote the rights of others, or a parent sacrificing for their child, and so on. So it certainly seems, at first blush, like people do not always act selfishly. They don't always do what is most in their self-interest. But there are lots of descriptive egoists, and they have an argument for their view. And that argument is this, what we call the wants argument for descriptive egoism. And it's pretty straightforward. Premise 1, you always do what you most want to do, and that can sound pretty plausible. Premise 2, you always most want to do what is most in your self-interest, and that can sound pretty plausible. From that, it follows that you always act selfishly. You always do what is most in your self-interest. So if, is this a good argument? Is it sound? Well, it's valid. No matter what, if the premises are true, the conclusion is true. But are the premises true, right? If the premises are true, then descriptive egoism is true, but we might wonder whether or not the premises are true. And that's what we're going to be thinking about for the rest of this module, is whether or not the premises of this argument are true. And what I'm going to suggest is that while both can seem plausible, they seem plausible when we're thinking about wants in a different way. When we think about wants in one way, what a want is, one premise sounds plausible. When we think about wants in a different way, the other premise sounds plausible. But if the argument's going to work, we need to find one meaning of want where they both are true, and that is very hard to find. So we're going to see that while if we mean want one way, one comes out true, and if we mean want a different way, the other comes out true. It's hard to find that one meaning of want where they both come out true. And if we can't find one meaning of want where they both come out true, then the argument doesn't succeed. So we'll see if we can do that. The question we want to think about is this feeling of duty a want? So Mengzi was talking about respect and commiseration and propriety and approval and disapproval and shame and dislike. And there are all these different sort of moral emotions and moral feelings, and we think of guilt and shame, pride, self-respect in this arena. And these are the sorts of feelings that are involved when we take ourselves to be acting in the right way or not acting in the right way. When we think that morality or ethics are up for grabs, those are the sorts of feelings that are involved in our motivation. So what we're going to see is, depending upon whether or not that feeling of duty is, depending on how we use the word want, these moral feelings are going to be or aren't going to be wants. And depending upon whether or not they are or are not wants, one or the other of the premises is going to come out false, or at least that's the way it's going to look. So let's get into that. Let's suppose that the feeling of duty is not a want. And there's a way of hearing the word want where this makes sense. And we can look at some examples, non-moral examples first, actually. So we could say, I don't want to save money, but I'm going to. Or, I don't want to not eat that cookie, but I'm going to. I'm going to not eat the cookie. Or, I don't want to go to the dentist, but I'm going to. So we do things that we don't want to. We're motivated. In all those cases, we're motivated to save the money or go to the dentist or not eat the cookie. We have a motivation. We don't do the thing because we're motivated not to do the thing, even though we want to. And so there's some motivation we have that's not a want. And you might think that something similar we can say is going on with moral motivation. So we could say, I don't want to tell the truth, but I'm going to. Or, I don't want to keep my promise, but I'm going to. Or, I don't want to help my friend, but I'm going to. And in all these cases, that sounds plausible. That's a coherent sentence. It makes sense. It could be true. So there's a thing you're going to do: keep your promise, tell the truth, help your friend. There's some motivation you have to do it because you're going to do it, but apparently that motivation, whatever it is, however we want to describe that, it's not actually a thing you want. So what do we mean? What are these moral motivations, and what are we talking about when we talk about wants and non-wants? Well, in this sense, when we say, I don't want to do it, but I'm going to, we probably mean want in something like this. Things like might be lust or hunger, thirst, greed. These are sort of, and when we think about motivations that are things that we wouldn't call a want, we might mean something like self-love, like self-respect, or just concern for my overall well-being. Respect, duty, obligation, empathy, sympathy. The line's probably not sharp here, but pride, moral dread, fear of committing an immoral action, and in some way sort of impurifying oneself. Different people operate in different ways here and have different of these. And so you wouldn't have to have all of them at all. I'm not suggesting you should. But what distinguishes wants from other motivations in this sense? Well, we want things that cause pleasure and stop pain, and we want things that cause pleasure now and stop pain now immediately. They often involve the body, sleeping, and sex and food. Satisfaction of them involves something happening in sort of sensory pleasure, sort of immediate sensory pleasure. So taste sensations, the feeling of fullness in our body. Whereas non-wants, they're probably mostly involved thinking and reasoning and higher functions that are unique maybe to humans, or at least that lots of animals don't have. So love for others, pride. We use thinking and reason to tell that these motivations are satisfied or not. Right? Hunger, you don't need to think. It's just, well, either it goes away or it doesn't. Whereas to be satisfied that you've done the right thing, you need to think, oh, I did the right thing, and it's a result of that thinking that you then have that feeling of satisfaction or pride. And so they don't involve sensory pleasures and pains in the same way. There's, as I said, probably not a strict or sharp line here. But if we're using want in this way, then we say, I don't always do what I most want to do. Not anyway if wants just involve things like lust and thirst and hunger and greed and so on. You do lots of things that you don't want to do because we have all sorts of other sorts of sophisticated motivations that are less Well, Plato would think of them, and perhaps Meng Di might think of them, as less animalistic and less base and more refined and distinctive of humanity. You might not want to agree with that distinction, but and so how exactly we describe the difference between a want and a non-want is itself a tricky issue. But if we're using want in this sort of fairly narrow sense that describe only a small part of our psychology, then you do lots of things you don't want to do because you have all sorts of other motivations. And so if wants are just this narrow thing, then we'd say, oh, actually, do you always do what you most want to do? No, you have lots of other kinds of motivations besides that. And in that case, then the argument comes out unsound. The argument, while it's valid, has a false premise. So if we interpret want in this narrow sense, then the first premise is false. Well, okay, the descriptive egoist might say, fine, you're right, if we interpret want in this narrow sense, as talking about things like lust and thirst and hunger and greed and so on, then that first premise is false. But I think there's another sense of want where want applies to more motivations, includes more motivations than just that narrow set, and on that way of talking about what wants are, the argument is going to work. And so in the next video, we're going to take a look at the descriptive egoist's attempt to say, okay, you're right, if we use want in this narrow sense, the argument doesn't work, but that's not really what I was thinking of, and I want to use the word want in a different way. So we'll look at that in the next video.